Hello everyone, my name is Sam Spade and welcome to another Coding Fundamentals in GML tutorial. In this tutorial, we're going to be talking about objects and instances in GameMaker Studio 2. To start with, objects in GameMaker Studio 2 are a specific thing and they don't really translate well to other languages. Other languages have objects, but the way objects work in other languages is not really the same way, at least on the surface, that they work in GameMaker Studio 2. So some of the things that we're going to talk about won't really transfer, but it's still very important to understand how GameMaker Studio 2 handles its version of objects, because a lot of things in GameMaker Studio 2 build off of that or rely on that in some way. The most important thing to take away about objects in GameMaker Studio 2 is that they are templates. You can think of them like blueprints or recipes. They don't actually exist when you run your game, at least not the way that you might think they do. Instances are specific things made using the object template, the object blueprint, and they do exist. If you have a blueprint of a chair, that blueprint exists as a blueprint, but there's not a chair there. It's just a recipe or instructions for how to make a chair. Once you make a chair, that chair does exist. So the blueprint is the object, and the chair is the instance of that object. This distinction is incredibly important, and if you can keep it in mind, a lot of things will make a lot more sense. Objects have properties. There are a variety of object properties in GameMaker Studio 2. These include things like the mask, the sprite, the object name, their parent or inheritance, their children, etc., persistence, and so on. You can set all of these properties inside of the GameMaker Studio 2 IDE. You can even get and set some of them while the game is running. Objects do not have variables. Instances have variables. Variables can be built in, so an instance in GameMaker Studio 2 has a ton of predefined variables, or they can be player created, as you have seen throughout these tutorials. Many variables are actually set by the object properties, so an object may have a sprite. When you create an instance of that object, the variable sprite index is going to refer to that default sprite given to the object. One very important thing to note is that if you change the object's property at runtime while the game is running, it will change the object's property, but it's not going to change that value for any instance that already exists. To return to the blueprint and chair metaphor, let's say that the blueprint calls for a red chair. So you make a red chair. Then you change the blueprint to say make blue chairs. That's not going to change the color of the chair that's already been made. It'll only change the color of future chairs that are made after that. Objects also have events. GameMaker has many predefined events that you can select from. They also allow you to create your own custom user events. And these events fall into one of two categories, either events that run every single game step or those that are triggered by a specific event. Instances, though, run events. So you write the code for an event in the GameMaker Studio 2 IDE inside of an object, but it's never the object. Again, it's never the blueprint that runs the code. It's the specific instance of that object that runs the code. And events are where all of the code is run. So if you write a script, that script is going to be run from inside of an event. The reason there's an asterisk here is because there are some very rare exceptions. There is room creation code, there are shaders, and you might maybe have an extension or something like that that runs code outside of events. But in general, virtually all of the code you write will be run inside of a specific instance's events. And it will be scoped to that instance. That means that that event or script will have access to that instance's variables. We are going to have a whole tutorial on events, and we'll cover all of these ideas in greater depth there. Finally, objects and instances both have IDs, and you can use both object and instance IDs in code. However, they are not interchangeable. There is an exception to this, which you can already see in the slide, and which I'll talk about in greater depth at the moment, but first I want to cover what instance and object IDs actually look like. At the present moment, object IDs are integers that start at 0 and increase by 1 for every object that you have in your resource tree. It's very important to remember that they're not strings. Instances also have IDs. They're normally 6-digit numbers, integers, that increase by 1 for every instance of any object that exists in the game. The way it's implemented right now might change in the future, but what is important is that they are different and, again, not interchangeable. The one exception is that you can access an instance through an object ID, But if you use an object ID to reference an instance, it's just going to pick one at random, which means that you should never do this. You should never access an instance through an object ID unless there is one and only one instance of that object present. Some final do's and don'ts. Don't use object functions on instances. Do remember, though, that objects are blueprints and only specific instances of an object actually exist. And finally, remember the difference between object IDs and instance IDs. So in summary, objects are templates. They don't exist. Instances of an object exist. Objects have properties and events, whereas instances have variables and run those events. As always, the links in this slide will be below, along with links to the source code and the slides themselves. And I want to call special attention to the last two of these. One is a tutorial on the official GameMaker community forums on the differences between objects and instances, and another is a tutorial on objects in the IDE, which will go over in greater detail things like how to create them, how to create events, how to change the properties, and so on. All right, that's it. Thanks for watching.